Evolution is awesome. Not just the title of this mini lecture, but an actual fact. Because I don't know what I'd rather read about, learn about, watch about, listen about more than about how all life that is on Earth or has existed on Earth came to be. So, evolution is the theory of how we have a single origin of life. So, sometime 4.5 billion years ago, there was a cell or a type of a cell or protocell or a part of a cell. And from this cell or these cells, we get the vast array of diversity that we see on the planet today. So, from 4.5 billion years ago, for something microscopic, we get octopuses and hippos and jellyfish and lemurs and snails and horses and people and all of it. So, how does all of that work? Absolutely fascinating. So, this mini lecture is going to be about giving you some real background on how does evolution work. So, how do we get from a single cell or protocell 4.5 billion years ago to where we are today? And really, it's going to introduce a lot of different terms for you to hopefully make the readings and the other videos that you have to watch easier for you to understand. So I hope you have your evolution notes document open and that you're ready to jot down some notes. Feel free to pause this at any time or back it up to help you. So without further ado, biological evolution is descent with modification. And it's through this process, descent with modification, the common ancestor of life on Earth gave rise to the fantastic diversity that we see documented in the fossil record and around us today. So that was a much nicer, prettier, more eloquent way of saying what I just said on the previous slide. But we're going to really get into what does descent with modification, what does that mean? Right? So I'm going to introduce some terms for you and we're going to walk through it. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll kind of understand what that means. Okay, so the first thing we need to think about is DNA, right? And hopefully everybody sort of knows what DNA is. You heard it maybe last year in 7th grade science, maybe before. Let's have a little review. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. So DNA is a molecule, right, that carries instructions for the development, functioning, growth, and reproduction of all known living organisms, and some viruses too. But viruses aren't technically alive. Anyways, anything that reproduces, most everything that reproduces has DNA. So DNA, again, is a molecule. So it's a thing. It's made up of nucleic acids. It's got a sugar phosphate backbone, right? It's found in the nucleus of your cell. Ooh, who remembers what that is, right? And it's like, it's a code, like it's a literal code, like it's an instruction book for basically how to make you, or how to make a snail, or how to make grass, or how to make trees, how to make whatever you want to make, right? And in this code, there are 4 nucleic acids, right? And they kind of look like this here, right? If I was to visualize their structure, because they're actual things, they're microscopic, you can't see them, but they're things, right? And there are 4 different things. They're adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, right? And they kind of interlocked with each other. Right? We represent them, we humans represent them with letters. So adenine is an A, thymine is a T, guanine is a G, cytosine is a C, right? And A and T's connect with each other, and G and C's connect with each other. And when you read these letters, right, they, in your cells, they make proteins, right? So just like how I can read this word here, right? I put a G, an R, an O, a W, a T, and an H, right? There's 26 letters in the alphabet, in the English alphabet. And I can put them together in different combinations and I can make words. And when I read those words, I understand like ideas, than what you mean, or instructions. So if I see a G, an R, an O, a W, a T, an H together, I know that says growth, right? So it's sort of like the same thing with your cells. They go ahead and they read these nucleic acids, and let's say they see an A, a T, a G, an A, a C, G, G, A, T, C together. Let's say that means blonde hair. Right? So they see that and they'll be like, oh, blonde hair, got it, right? Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's basically what's going on here. Okay? So that brings us to our next term of genes. So there are regions of DNA that code for a particular trait, like hair color or height or how many taste buds you have on your tongue or the size of your feet, the type of acid you have in your stomach, all sorts of things, right? If you're an oak tree, it'll encode for the size of your leaves, all sorts of different things, like things you can see, and also boring things within your cells, like ribosomes or lysosomes, or your immune system. Obviously, there's genes for different parts of your immune systems. There's genes for anything. So again, the genes are just these specific things, right? It's a part of DNA, right, that encode for a particular trait. So there's a gene for hair color, there's a gene for height, there's a gene for everything about you. There's a gene, so there's a region of DNA that says, hey, this needs to be like this, right? There's a gene that helps with the expression of how many fingers you should have. Like people should have 5 fingers, right? A thumb, 4 fingers. Hopefully you're with me so far. Hopefully this isn't too new for you either. Now, genes, right? This is an important part of evolution. Genes are passed on. If genes weren't passed on, evolution wouldn't work, right? And the fancy name for this is called heredity. Now, I all know you've made something like this at some point in time in your life, in your schooling career, where you have like, this is my dad, and this is my mom, and this is what I look like, because I have some traits with my dad, and I have some traits with my mom, and I get me. So heredity is a system in which genes are passed on from parents to offspring. Okay? Evolution wouldn't work, right? We wouldn't give any changes in life over time if genes weren't passed on, right? If we had to start from scratch every single time, right? We need genes to be heritable. So they have to be able to be passed on, and they are. So that's great. What else do we need for evolution to work is genetic variation, right? That sounds like it should be complicated, but it's just like, look at the words. It's variation or differences in genes. That's all it means. So genetic variation is the genetic differences there are within populations or species, right? So I have a couple different examples. So these are actually different species of finches, right? And they have variations in the genes that encode for their beaks, right? So this beak is like a big beak. This is a narrow beak. This is a small beak. This is a very narrow beak. So they all have a gene. Usually it's not one gene. Usually it's like multiple genes working together. But for simplicity's sake, we'll say gene. For beak size, right? And this gene says make a big beak. This one says make a medium beak. This one says make a small beak. This one says make a thin beak. We also have them for butterflies. So this is actually a family of butterflies, right? And these are different genes we have for different colorings in their patterns here, right? And these genes are pretty different here. You have lots of brown here, and this is more stripy. This one's got more yellow. This one's more dotted. You can see these two are very similar in their genes. This one's just a little bit bigger, thicker white line than this one. And again, these are very similar too. There's just little differences in the stripes, right? So there are genes for color of these butterflies, right? Color and patterns, but we see variation within the gene for color and pattern. We see this in human species too, right? There's lots of variation between people, and this is just on appearances. So there's variation in hair color, hair type, facial hair, skin color, size, eye color, all sorts of stuff like that. So, for evolution to work, you need genetic variation. And as we go through this, you're going to find out the more variation a species has, the more likely that species is going to be able to survive. Now, how do we get all of this variation, right? How do we get new traits, right? Because obviously, if we started from one cell, right, that one cell didn't have a lemur's tail, right? That one cell didn't have what, like little eye spots that this sea slug has, right? So, how do we get new traits, right? We know from heredity we can mix up the traits, right? But we're not really getting brand new traits here, right? We're just like recombining these traits, right, in different ways. So, how do we get brand new traits? Well, the main way that we get brand new traits are through mutations. So, a lot of time we think of Wolverine or the X-Men when we think of mutations. Mutations they're not that dramatic. And they don't result in superpowers, but that would be amazing. Don't try to mutate yourself. That's a bad idea. You just die. So you remember how I said way back here that DNA had these letters, right? There were nucleic acids and they encode for things, right? So mutations are like changes in the DNA sequence. So here, this is called a point mutation, right? There was a sequence of TAACTGCAGGT, right? And cells make mistakes all the time, constantly. So when DNA makes a copy of itself, that's usually when the mistakes happen. And here, when the DNA was copying itself, instead of putting a T, it put a C, right? So it made a mistake, right? So that's called a mutation. Mutations can also be bigger too. So let's say this was a gene, and there's always lots of like just random bits of DNA floating around in your cells, right? Because it's like a soup, it's a cell. And sometimes random bits of DNA can get copied into inserted. So this is called an insertion mutation, where like this AATT, right, got inserted, right? And it changed this, right? So that's a mutation, right? Just like if I changed a letter in a word, it could make a new word. Like if, let's say, let me do an example here. I'll do a simple word. So let's say I have the word has, right? And let's say I'm copying it down and I miss S and I can't spell and I make mistakes all the time. And let's say I copy it down, but I change that S for a T. Now I have hat, right? So that's a completely different word, right? And this is has, right? So two different things. So mutations are the ultimate source of genetic variation, right? So, and that's how blue eyes came to be. Blue eyes, all humans had brown eyes. And then there was a mutation I'd have to look it up. I'm sorry, 100,000, thousands of years ago, a long time ago. It was in the Balkans, I believe. There was a single mutation that changed the color to blue. So blue eyes are a mutation that are now all over in our population today that we still carry with us. So mutations are changes in the DNA sequence due to error. So mutations are mistakes. Mistakes are good things. You should all make mistakes, right? That's how new things happen. People didn't make mistakes, nothing new would ever happen. They are mostly random. So usually mutations are just random mistakes that you make. There's some exceptions to that. There's some sorts of radiations and things like that that cause specific mutations, but 99.9% of mutations are random. And usually they have no effect on the organism. In fact, you have about 50 point mutations in your body right now that do nothing to you, right? Do nothing at all to your code, right? Because there's room for error, right? Error is built in, knowing that we're going to make some mistakes and that's okay. However, sometimes a mutation will result in a new gene variant, like blue eyes, right? This is rare, right? But over the course of 4.5 billion years, There's been a lot of them, right? And these mutations are the ultimate source of genetic variation. So they give us all this types of variation that we see here. All right, so natural selection. I know you've heard this term before, right? Natural selection is just one part of evolution. It's actually 4 mechanisms of evolution. We're only going to talk about 2 of them, mutation and natural selection. All right, so natural selection. Here I got a scenario for you here, right? So let's say there are bugs, beetles, right? And some are green and some are brown. And they're living their beetle life. And then there's these birds, right? And these beetles walk around on dirt, right? So as this bird flies by, right, dirt's brown, it's going to see the green beetle more. It's going to be like, hey, I see you. I'm going to eat you, right? Over time, there's going to be less of the green beetle, right? And more of the brown beetles are going to survive. More of the brown beetles are going to pass on their brown beetle genes, right, to create more brown beetle offspring. And eventually, the population will be mostly brown beetles, right? Now, what if the natural selection, they often call it survival of the fittest. In this scenario, the brown beetle trait was more beneficial. I don't like the term fittest. It actually makes me really angry. It actually makes a lot of scientists really angry. It's better to say fitter, right? Because what if the environment changes? What if these beetles weren't walking on sand, but on leaves, green leaves, right? Then it would be a lot easier to see the brown beetles, and the population would have changed to favor the green beetles. So this is why it's really important. Natural selection is the process that results in the adaptation of an organism to its environment. To its environment. So it selects genes that work well for the environment that it's in, right? By means of selectively reproducing traits or genes. Genetic variation is essential because natural selection can only increase or decrease the frequency of genes already in the population. Natural selection can't make new genes, new traits. Natural selection can't make green beetles or brown beetles or purple beetles. It just chooses which trait works best in that given situation. So that's why it's so important to have lots of variation, because you don't know how the environment's going to change. So you want lots of different variation in there for natural selection to work with, right? So if, let's say this is the brown beetle population, but let's say, I don't know, climate change happens, some other thing happens where that environment changes. And now all of a sudden the dirt is purple, right? It's likely that these beetles are going to go extinct because there's no more variation here. They have nowhere to go. They have nothing in their toolkit to pull out, right? So the more variation you have in a species, the more likely it's going to be able to survive changes within the environment, which is a good thing, which is why some things survive and other things go extinct. So biological evolution is descent, so passing along traits, that's heredity, with modification. I hope you enjoyed this mini lecture. I hope you enjoy the rest of the videos and readings you have. Have a wonderful day.